can open up your Bibles to the book of Daniel, chapter 2, verse 1. Chapter 2, verse 1. Liz.
And in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar dreamed dreams, wherewith his spirit was troubled, and his sleep brake from him.
Okay, some introductory points. Number 1. The second chapter, guys, it opens up with a chronological peg because it tells us it's the second year of Nebuchadnezzar, which means that then we can date the events in chapter 2 to 603 BC, to 603. Now, as we remember from last week, Nebuchadnezzar, for the most part, he played like a secondary role in the chapter. Right? He was kind of just right on the edges of the stage, as it were, and doesn't come and really have a part of the scene until the end of it. Whereas in chapter 2, he takes front and center stage in the book. Now, the events of chapter 2, guys, these would have happened some 3 years after the events in chapter 1. Now, an ancient Greek copy of the book of Daniel dates this to the 12th and not the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. I'm sure it's the second, and we'll see why momentarily, but it was just a slip of the pen. The 2 became 12. And this happens. It happens inadvertently and purposefully. Like in 1 John chapter 5, verse 7, someone deliberately added, and there are 3 that bear witness in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these 3 are one. And then, verse 8 is, and there are 3 that bear witness on earth, the Spirit, and the water, and the blood, and these 3 agree in one. It is what it is. It's stuck in there. Someone put it in there deliberately, and it's not in any of the oldest texts. These things happen, like in the book of Ephesus, verse 1. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God, to the saints which are Ephesus, and to the faithful in Christ Jesus. All of the oldest copies say, Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, by the will of God, to the saints and faithful which are in Christ Jesus. A very universal letter. That phrase, which are at Ephesus, someone put in some time in order to give the book a home. Nevertheless, the reason I bring these scribal errors up is because, remember when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, before that, in 1947, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible in the world was the Aleppo Codex, which was from 1000 AD. Okay? 1,000 years after Jesus, and it wasn't even complete. Part of it was damaged. But when you line up the Aleppo Codex with the Dead Sea Scrolls, they're like 95+% the same. And the major variants are spelling. Like in King James music is spelled M-U-S-I-C-K. And numerical errors. The account in 2 Samuel chapter 5, when the Philistines bring the ark to Bet-Shemesh, the authorized King James version says 50,070 people were killed when they were probably a little suspicious if the Philistines took the rod of Aaron and the tablets and etc. out of the ark. They wanted to check and make sure they were still there. But other texts say not 50,070, but 70 were slain. That's a big difference. I mean, that's half of Reading, California, 50,000 people. Now, who knows? We weren't there if there was 50,000, 70 or 70. The point is these things happen, but none of the variants are doctrinal for the most part. They're numerical or spelling changes. Nevertheless, now, the opening verse doesn't pose a problem at all to us because, number 1, that the education of these young men took 3 years. We found that out from chapter 1. And year year 1 was in the ascension year of Nebuchadnezzar, which we could think of as year 0 in his reign, if that makes sense. And this, of course, his beginning of his reign took place before the Babylonian New Year holiday, which is called Akitu, A-K-I-T-U. And this was a time of year in the spring where the king was coronated, where prisoners were set free, like at the end of 2 Chronicles. Okay? And the 2 Chronicles mentions this time of year. So, the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign would have been the third year of the children of Israel's education, because remember, we're counting from 0 and not 1. Okay? So it doesn't pose a problem at all. Okay. Also, we have to keep in mind, in the world of the Bible, in the ancient Near East, is that if a second, an hour, or a day is part and parcel of the event, it's still considered a day. Like, and we're not going to try and crack this nut right now, but as Jonah was in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights, so the Son of Man was 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. 3 days and 3 nights. Now let's just go with the traditional, right, Friday. Friday 3 p.m. is dead. Okay, that's a day. Remember, the day doesn't start at 12:01. The day starts when you see 3 stars in the sky. So you got Friday night, you got Saturday morning, Saturday night, and Sunday morning. That's not 3 days and 3 nights. You with me? It's not 72 hours. In their world, it doesn't have, all it has to be is just 1 second of one day, and that counts as a day. Okay? So that's also is built into this verse. Okay? The second year of Nebuchadnezzar, but really the third year, right, of his reign. Okay. Now, again, Josephus states that the second year of Nebuchadnezzar should be interpreted as 2 years after Babylon's defeat of Egypt. And we know that from history that that's 605 as well. Now, on a different note, here's what Nebuchadnezzar's profile looks like. I found him from a Babylonian coin. So when we're trying to picture him in the narrative, etc., right? He's not a cucumber and VeggieTales, okay? He's a real person. And he probably looks something along those kinds of lines, okay? Now, we're going to see here that the author of the book continues to draw parallels between Daniel and Joseph. Daniel and Joseph. The Hebrew prophets, both of them in captivity. Both of them were young, and both of them rose through the ranks of Gentile power after 2 years. Genesis 41:1. Both of them did this by the unseen hand of the Most High God to save the multitudes and to rise to influence. And just as Nebuchadnezzar's spirit was troubled, Genesis 41:8, so was Pharaoh's spirit troubled after his dream as well. So you see the links between Joseph and Daniel. And there is his dream. Okay. Verse 2. Zach.
Then the king gave commanders, Then the king gave command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dream. So they came and stood before the king.
Okay, so just as Nebuchadnezzar the king summons his royal magi, his royal elite, to come and to discern the meaning of the dream before the prophet shows up on the scene, Genesis 41:8. In the Joseph account, the Pharaoh does the same exact thing. Okay. Now, it's probable that the author, Daniel, had the Torah memorized, and of course, through the Holy Spirit, he he's crafting, he's building up this story with this Joseph account in mind, because the parallels are too striking. No, it's not a coincidence. Now, some people have mentioned that these above mentioned guilds, the astrologers, the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, etc., that they're different classes of the Magi in Babylon. And that is quite possible. But if we do a little bit of a word study, we'll see that the term used for these guys, for these magicians, is Chartumim. Now, why does that matter? Because Chartumim is an Egyptian loan word. It's an Egyptian word. And that word for magician means something like a sacred scribe, or it can mean someone who is skilled in writing and in understanding hieroglyphics. That's what the term magician means. It's an Egyptian loan word. Okay? Now, if indeed these are Egyptians, which they are, and these Egyptian magicians are in Nebuchadnezzar's court, this would fit very nicely with the fact that 2 years earlier he just invaded Egypt, sacked the city, put up the Babylonian flag, and as in Judah, takes captive the elite, does the same thing in Egypt. Exporting international men of distinction for his purposes in government. Yes?
If that's what the word means, why is it translated in our Bible as magician?
Magician. That's a good question, Wesley. Why is it translated magician? Because it's, as you know, it's not a commentary. It's just the text. And so it would be a nice footnote to say, right in the column, magi is an Egyptian word, right? That means someone skilled in understanding or writing hieroglyphics, or what's the other word I used? A sacred scribe. One of those two. And there's a big difference, isn't there, between a sacred scribe and a magician in the 21st century. Because when we think of magician, we think of Harry Potter, right? Or something like that. Yeah. It's, I would surmise that the more modern translations hopefully have updated that word. Have they?
Mine says magicians.
What translation?
NAS.
The NAS says Egyptian. It says magician also. Yeah. It's definitely an Egyptian loan word. Yeah. Okay, good. Please feel free to ask questions. That's why I'm here.
So when you put all those together,
Yeah.
you take them all together, are you saying they're all a sacred trade or a magical trade or?
Good question. Well, we're not totally sure what's going on here, but these are different guilds, different sects of the quote-unquote wise men of Babylon. And that particular sect of the wise men of Babylon are these imported magicians. Yeah. I think of a very international assembly. Good. Verse 3, Helena Patterson, or soon to be, not soon enough, right?
The king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to understand the dream.
Good. Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, Kathy brought cookies. And not just any kind of cookies. Okay? Like Disneyland quality cookies. Okay. So during break, we can devour them. Okay. Now, so the king's talking to these different guilds. They probably look something like this, because this is a representation of a Babylonian relief. So think of that kind of image when you're thinking of these guys. So once these local or these national, these international experts of knowledge, once they were summoned up to the royal palace and to the throne room, the king informs them to interpret or to give the correct understanding of the dream that he had the night before. Now we'll unpack this more as we go. We're just going verse by verse by verse. Okay, verse number 4. Jamie.
Then the astrologers answered the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will interpret it.
Okay, so this expression that we see quite often in the scriptures, O king, live forever. This is a very common term of etiquette in the ancient Near East. If you're watching Downton Abbey like I am, you will notice that whenever the servants speak, they will say, your ladyship, or something like that, right? This is proper etiquette. That's all it is. 1 Kings 1:31 is another example where Bathsheba says this to David, O king, live forever. Nehemiah says it to Artaxerxes in Nehemiah 2:3. But the funny thing is that the king is going to just be made aware that he will not live forever as we unfold the story here. So herein begins this unique literary transferring in the original languages from Hebrew to Aramaic. It starts right here in the midst of this verse in 2:4. Okay, so 1:1 to 2:3 are in Hebrew, and now we kind of in mid-stride switch horses to a different tongue until chapter 7, verse 28. On the screen behind me, you're looking at Biblical Hebrew, Aramaic, and cuneiform, Chaldean-ish kind of writing. And as you can see, the Hebrew and the Aramaic are very similar, aren't they? See that alphas? They're really close to the same. Some of the gimels kind of, look at the hays, right? The vobs, look how close they are. Okay? So they're like related languages. Kind of think of like maybe, I don't know, maybe like Spanish and Italian. Okay? You know one, you kind of, right, you can, for the most part, right, you can work with the other. Now, why do this? Good question. In the book of Jeremiah, this is the only other time in the Hebrew Bible where the author switches from Hebrew to Aramaic. And Jeremiah does that in chapter 10, verses 11 and 12. And the reason they do this is likely because this was the lingua franca, the English of the day. And Jeremiah wanted that saying of the Creator God in chapter 10, verses 11 and 12, mastered, memorized, and spread throughout the Fertile Crescent. Okay? Now, along the same lines, the author of the book probably, right, intends to reach a larger audience, a larger demographic, by changing the language of the book from Hebrew to Aramaic. And part and parcel of that is because the section in Aramaic 2:4 to 7:28 largely deals with Gentile nations. Right? When in Rome kind of thing. Right? If you're going to speak to the Gentiles, speak to them in their tongue, etc. When it's largely geared towards Jews, so to speak, we'll do it in Hebrew. Now, by the time the Jews returned from Babylon back to Israel under Cyrus, and we'll talk more about him later, but that's the Cyrus cylinder that, of course, declares the Jews' right to go back. We'll talk more about that later. But the people were so entrenched, the Jews so entrenched in Aramaic, that we find out from Nehemiah 8:8 that an interpreter was needed to make sense of the scriptures. Verse 5. Yes, Brian, please.
It's interesting that the Aramaic is enveloped or looking in Hebrew. So it's almost as though that the kingdoms of men are being enveloped by the kingdom of God in Hebrew.
Good. Very good. Yeah.
Does the location, Syriac, mean anything? Is that Syria? What does that mean? one. The king.
Then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Syriac. Yes, it means Aramaic. Yeah.
Okay, there's a language in Aramaic.
Right.
Thank you.
So Aramaic, exactly.
And that was the location.
Right. This is the lingua franca at that time. Whereas 800 years earlier, when the cats, remember we talked about the cats and the mice, the geopolitical world of the Bible, right? And about 1400 in the Amarna letters, these 400 tablets that were found in Egypt, that was communication between the cats. The other powers at that time, the lingua franca was wedge-shaped cuneiform writing. It just changed them, just like today's English, right? Everyone speaks English, kind of thing. Yeah.
Especially the Aramaic was also when you think of Syrian. And in the time of Christ, that doesn't when you think of,
Exactly.
that really translated all the way through.
Yeah, exactly. And then, of course, Greek takes over, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Right? Greek takes over as the lingua franca in the New Testament era. Right. Very good. Okay. Hopefully it's never Mandarin, because I would be lost. 감사합니다. Yubaseyo. That's all I know. Korean.
That's Korean, I was going to say.
Yes. Okay. Chapter 2, verse 5. Zach, you look horrified. Why don't you read that verse?
The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, "My decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut into pieces, and your house shall be made an ash heap."
Okay. Before dangling this proverbial carrot before them, with being able to bless them if they receive a reward for interpreting it, he does what's very similar in that part of the world. Is you have a treaty of blessings and cursings. If you do this, I will do this. If you do that, I will do that, kind of thing. Okay. Nevertheless, literally cutting someone into pieces was very common, believe it or not. I don't know about very common. It was common even in the scriptures in 1 Samuel 15:33. 1 Samuel 15:33. Samuel the prophet cuts Agag the Agagite into pieces. What you're seeing here is a representation of Assyrian soldiers cutting the idol into pieces. Okay. I'm not sure what the idol, well, anyways, this is the idea, something like that. Okay. Yes?
Yeah, for Samuel.
15:33. 15:33. Now, according to Assyrian and Babylonian customs, even in Israel customs, which we'll get to momentarily, the house in which the condemned lived was to be sometimes destroyed or at least left vacant as a visual reminder of this curse, this perpetual curse upon the people of that house, like Jericho, right? No one shall ever build or inhabit this city again. Verse 6. Verse 6. Wesley, read that one.
But if you declare the dream and its interpretation, you will receive from me gifts and reward and great honor. Therefore declare to me the dream and its interpretation.
Very good. So after he dangles the threat in front of them, now he dangles the carrot of the blessing in front of them. And Genesis 41, 42, and 43. 41, 42, 43. Just like Pharaoh and the Joseph account, the custom of bestowing gifts on the correct interpreter of the dream, the same package is given here. This image shows gifts being brought to a king. Something like that. Have that, something like that in your mind's eye. Okay, 2:7. 2:7, Liz.
They answered again and said, "Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation of it."
Okay, so here we have the beginning of the second round. The second round of dialogue between the wise men, quote unquote, and the king. Act 2, as it were. Act 2 is when they met. You guys don't know what song that's from. Okay, it's okay. So these wise men, quote unquote, especially if they're from Egypt, they would have been very familiar with this status quo of the Pharaoh bringing them in, right, offering them reward, right, etc., including correct interpretation of the dream. But Nebuchadnezzar here senses their foolishness, and he's keen on testing them, testing their wit, by requiring them to invoke both the dream itself and the correct interpretation of it. Verse number 8. Elaine.
The king replied, I know for certain that you are bargaining for time, and as much as you have seen that the command from me is firm.
Okay, so Nebuchadnezzar sees right through them. He surmises that they're trying to placate him. They're trying to buy for time to escape this judgment, this impending judgment. So what does this phrase, quote unquote, the thing is gone from me, mean? He says it, the king says it right here. The thing is gone from me. What in the world is going on here? Did Nebuchadnezzar forget the dream? Probably not. Some have suggested the statement should be rendered or translated instead, the matter is decided by me. So how that would read, the king said, I know of a certainty that you would gain the time because you see the matter is decided by me. Or, as the Strong's Concordance suggests, the word is gone out from me. And that makes much more sense. The king answered and said, I know of a certainty that you would gain the time because you see that the word is going out from me. God doesn't reveal apocalyptic end time dreams to kings to have them forget them in the morning. Okay? Verse 9. Mr. Skipper.
If you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. You have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the times change. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall show you, and I shall know that you shall show me the interpretation.
Okay. So, in other words, certainly Nebuchadnezzar mastered the dream. He knew the dream, and these liars, these charlatans, are oblivious to the content of the dream. They have no idea what it's about. And they have concocted lying words and false interpretations to tickle his ears. Now, a basis, and this is just a possibility, of the king's suspicion may be that he thought, there's always counts intrigue, okay? It's possible that these guys he thought were part and parcel of some kind of internal attempt to overthrow his throne. You never know. But nevertheless, the kings in this part of the world, they were not hesitant to execute people who they thought to be a political threat. Example, right there. King Saul, via Doeg, the Edomite, executes 85 people that wore a linen ephod because they assisted in giving King David showbread. So these kings had no qualm, right, about wiping out anyone in the palace who seems to be a threat to their rule and reign. Verse 10. Verse 10. Got that one around?
The Chaldeans answered before the king and said, there is not a man upon the earth that can show the king's matter. Therefore there is no king, lord, nor ruler that asks such things as any magician or astrologer or God.
Good. So as we read in the third between the king and his court. These quote-unquote wise men, who are being asked the absolute impossible, tell me the dream and the interpretation of the dream. They provide the main point of the chapter. And the main point is the same as Genesis 41:16 in the Joseph story. That it is not in man God shall give an answer of peace, just like Joseph said. That's the main point. Verse 11. Verse 11. Zach.
It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh.
Okay, so the wise men, these guys are taken aback. They're shocked by the king not abiding by the rules, by the status quo of the ancient Near East. And first telling us the dream, so then we could spin it to its proper interpretation. You're not following the rules. Now, by not abiding by the rules, the status quo, these guys, in this verse right here, they're pressed to confess that they're unable to intercede with the God of heaven and to have his secrets revealed. Okay? Now, therefore, the dialogue between the king and his advisors in the royal court is now over. So we're going to shift scenes, as it were, into verse number 12. Verse 12.
Because of this, the king became indignant and very furious, and gave orders to destroy all the wise men of Babylon.
Okay, so after discerning that these enchanting guilds, these group of men were a charade, a farce, a lie, the despot Nebuchadnezzar, he becomes angry and furious. And we'll see later in Daniel 3:13 that this is a picture, this is an expression, a motif to describe his wrath, angry and furious. So he immediately makes a decree to execute anyone who's enrolled in any of these professions in all of his royal courts. Now, probably not necessarily those enchanters or those magicians or those sacred scribes within the entire empire, because then he would have no one, right? But those, right, which were probably just, right, in the heart of it all, in Babylon. It appears Nebuchadnezzar, if there was something cooking, he was on to their possible plot to remove him from the throne. Maybe, maybe not. But nevertheless, he was exhausted with these people, and they're professing to have the ability to divine the dream. Yes?
Well, if they admitted that only a God, whoever that is, can interpret the dream or give the dream, then why doesn't he? He doesn't seem to be, well, get on with it.
I know.
Where's the God?
Exactly.
Who is he?
He's the God in heaven, which we'll find out more in a minute.
They're setting Daniel up.
Exactly. Without knowing it, they're setting Daniel up on a silver platter. Exactly. Verse 13. Verse 13. Jane?
So the decree was issued to put the wise men to death, and men were sent to look for Daniel and his friends to put them to death.
Okay, so unlike the rulers of the following Medo-Persian kingdom, which we'll find out more throughout the course, right? Unlike those rulers who were unable to change or to reverse the decree that they made, like in Daniel, right? They say, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which altereth not. Chapter 6, I think it's verse 6, something like that. We can't alter it. It's been proclaimed. Nebuchadnezzar, the dictator, has the ability to pass legislation with without any obstacles or the stigma that is attached, the stigma of shame that is attached by some of changing your mind. So Daniel and his fellows were previously, they were either willingly or they were unwillingly absorbed into one of these previous mentioned guilds. The diviners, the magicians, the Chaldeans, right? They were put into one of those guilds, his three friends, and Daniel himself. And this probably happened upon graduation. And therefore, they would, like everyone else, be rounded up and quickly executed, even though they were not present at the just above mentioned meeting between the king and his royal advisors. Now, the preceding events, what we just heard, these events, they paved the way, like Ron said, for the entrance of Daniel on the scene to declare and interpret the dream and to provide the correct interpretation. Who the Lord makes the diviners mad, like Isaiah says in 44:25. In other words, it is to put on display, public display, the impotence of the gods of Babylon, chiefly Marduk, and to glorify the dispenser of true wisdom and power, Yahweh, the God of heaven. Verse 14, it's a battle of the gods. When you get down to the nitty-gritty, like in Nacho Libre, get down to the nitty-gritty. Never mind. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Yes, it's a cultural thing. Okay. Wesley, verse 14.
Then Daniel replied with discretion and discernment to Arioch, the captain of the king's bodyguard, who had gone forth to slay the wise men of Babylon.
Good. So at this point in the narrative, the scene shifts towards Daniel and Daniel's friends, which give the reader, if you've ever heard or read this before, the sense of anticipation that these guys indeed can somehow, some way, through God's help, put a stop to this royal decree. Now, after the decree went forth, what does Daniel do? Daniel sought out Arioch. This is the first mention of him in the book. Arioch was the captain of the royal guard. That is to say, he is the chief of executioners. And because he was the chief of the guards, he was likely an eyewitness to the events that just took place in the palace throne room. His name, Arioch, Ariochu, you see right here, probably means something like servant of the moon god, maybe, something like that. And you can see an image of the moon right there. One of the chief deities of Babylon, the moon god's also, his name is Sin, S-I-N. Nevertheless, Arioch was a familiar name in the world of the Bible. It's a common name. It's used in Genesis 14:1. Arioch, the king of the Chaldeans. So it's a very common name. Right? The servant of the moon god. The city of Jericho literally means city of the moon. It's the oldest city on earth. And who do they worship at Jericho? The moon. The moon. Okay. Let's continue. Now, in 2 Kings 25, 8 and 9, and Jeremiah 39:9, and Jeremiah 39:9, we have another guy mentioned as the chief executioner in Nebuchadnezzar's army. His name was Nabuzaradan. And this guy would have been the man who carried out the order to destroy the temple in Jerusalem on the night of Av in 586 and carry the captives away. So it says Nebuchadnezzar did this and Nebuchadnezzar did that, right? Well, technically he did it. I mean, he's sitting on his throne, Nabuzaradan, right? These kind of guys, right? They're the ones who are doing his dirty work. Now, Daniel followed the royal, the proper protocol to inquire of the king's decision from Arioch. Because at this point, Daniel does not have instant access to the throne. But he has access to Arioch, who has not yet begun to carry out the mass execution. So Daniel is using a middleman, a very common and even to this day wise move on your chessboard of life is using middlemen to get things done. Okay? Verse 15. Liz.
He answered and said to Arioch, the king's captain, "Why is the decree so hasty from the king?" Then Arioch made the king known to Daniel, made the thing known to Daniel.
Okay. On the screen behind you, you're seeing an image of the captain of the guard, probably Nabuzaradan, mentioned in Jeremiah 39:9, with the spear in his hand leading away Jewish captives. Okay? So when you think of the chief of the guard, the executioner, you try to think of them, something along those kind of lines, right? With the spear held up behind his head. But back to the verse, Daniel seems perplexed, totally perplexed by the impulsiveness of the harsh and the hasty decree, and he wants to know what was the cause and effect of the decree. How did this come to happen? And we'll find out momentarily, but we'll note here, as a footnote kind of, that the title for Arioch changes slightly from the previous verse. And this title is more general than the previous one, right? He's called here the king's captain. In the previous verse, he's called the captain of the king's guard. Just a minor point, but we'll move on. Verse 16. Zach?
So Daniel went in and asked the king to give him time, that he might tell the king the interpretation.
Okay, so it's like in Downton Abbey. It's like, what's her name? Mrs. Patmore's helper in the kitchen? Daisy. Daisy cannot just go upstairs to Lord Grantham's bedroom and walk in. I mean, you just don't do that. Okay? That's impossible. Just like Daniel here. But Daniel, who Esther later parallels a little bit, at least here, risks life and limb by petitioning the king without prior invitation for the salvation of the people and the pagan wise men. Proverbs in 25:6 exhorts the reader not to put forth yourself in the presence of the king. Not unless, well, maybe you want to share the gospel with them, so then you can pray about it. And then you can make it happen. Like he did it for me. The king of Israel. Later on in chapter 2, verse 24, we'll see the proper etiquette, the proper courtroom etiquette for obtaining an audience with the king, which included a middleman, as we'll see, to arrange the meeting between the king and the peon. Once in the unannounced presence of the king of the world, Daniel did not beseech him for an unlimited amount of time, but for a very near future pre-arranged appointment between the two concerning the matter, which included, apparently here, included a brief delay in the immediate execution
So Arioch didn't arrange this, he just went in.
That's what it seems like from our first read. That's what it seems like. That's what it seems like. Now, it's possible that Nebuchadnezzar remembered 3 years earlier on graduation day when Daniel walked the aisle. Because in those oral examinations in his presence, Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams, chapter 1, verse 17. So maybe, just maybe, right in the back of his memory, he recognized this young bachelor's degree student. Okay. Verse 18. I'm sorry, verse 17. 17. Kathy, you got that one?
And Daniel went to his house and made the thing known to Hananiah and Mishael and Azariah, his companions.
So the scene now shifts from the royal court, which you can see on the screen ahead of you. The scene now shifts from the royal court, from the royal palaces, to the dorms, to the dormitories of the young men being educated in the learning and tongue of the Chaldeans. Once again, we see here is that the author of the book is recognizing and reminding us of the Hebrew roots of these young men by not calling them Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. He's calling them by their Hebrew names, what their mommy called them. And therefore, he's not identifying them with this Babylonian world system. Right? They're in the world, but they're not of this world, kind of thing. Okay? Verse 18. Mr. Skipper.
He told them to seek mercy from God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon.
Okay. Well, up to this point in the book of Daniel, the God of Israel has only been identified as Elohim Adonai. Okay? In fact, in the entire book of Daniel, there is only one place, chapter 9, where the tetragrammaton, the Yahweh name is used. It's always Elohim or it's always Adonai in the book, not Yahweh. And the only time Yahweh is used is in Daniel's great prayer in chapter 9. Interesting. So it's not, Yahweh is not used in the Aramaic section at all. Nevertheless, so by connecting a place to the name of the God, which he does right here, he calls him the God of heaven, Daniel recognizes him as the invisible, the most high God, the God who ascends the heights of the clouds, the God who's far above all of the visible idols that their hands have made and that dwell on earth. What's interesting here is that the Septuagint translation, it heightens the situation. It makes it more interesting because it adds that Daniel also proclaimed a fast and a supplication. And he very well could have. It's just that we've lost that in our authorized versions of the text, but it's in the Septuagint. So it could read then that they would desire the mercies of the God of heaven concerning the secret, that Daniel and his fellows should not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon, and that they proclaimed a fast and supplication. Okay, that's in the Septuagint. Maybe.